I am Aaliyah, 35 years old, and after my grandfather Silas had his funeral, I did not tell my parents that he had left me $25 million. I am so glad I kept it a secret, because a week later, what he revealed about their past shocked me to the core. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. Growing up in Atlanta, Georgia meant status and appearance were everything to my parents. Inside our sprawling brick home, emotional coldness and strict financial control permeated every corner. My childhood was a fortress of impossible expectations I could never quite meet because the rules were designed for me to fail. My younger sister Kendra was the golden child who received private tutors, brand new cars, and endless praise. I was the scapegoat left to fund my own life while bearing the weight of their constant criticism. I maintained straight grades, built my own technical skills, and eventually escaped their toxicity to build a highly successful cybersecurity firm. I kept my wealth entirely hidden from them, knowing they would only use it to destroy me further. The true depth of their cruelty finally exposed itself on the darkest day of my life. The air inside my grandfather Silas and his massive Atlanta estate felt heavy and thick with the smell of fried chicken, baked macaroni and cheese, and the overwhelming floral perfume of a dozen church elders. It was exactly 2 hours after we had lowered the only man who ever truly loved me into the ground. The repast was in full swing. I stood in the massive kitchen, leaning against the marble island, gripping a glass of ice water to keep my hands from shaking. The sounds of forced laughter and hushed gossip drifted from the formal living room, where my parents were holding court. I wore a simple black morning dress, focusing on the steady rhythm of the rain, hitting the floor-to-ceiling windows, overlooking the manicured backyard. I wanted to grieve in peace. That peace shattered when 2 heavy black plastic garbage bags landed on the pristine hardwood floor right at my feet. I looked up to see my mother Vivian glaring at me. She held a thick roll of packing tape in her manicured hand. Her custom black dress looked more suited for a fashion runway than a funeral, complete with a string of pearls she had undoubtedly purchased on credit just for this occasion. "Pack your bags, Aaliyah," she ordered, her voice dropping into that familiar, commanding tone she had used to belittle me for 3 decades. "You have exactly 30 minutes before Connor changes the locks on all the doors." I did not flinch. I slowly set my water glass down on the marble counter, feeling the cold condensation against my skin. I looked at the cheap plastic bags, and then back up at the woman who had spent my entire life making me feel like a burden. Before I could respond, the swing door from the dining room pushed open, and my younger sister Kendra walked in. Kendra was 32 years old and had worn the title of the perfect daughter like a weapon since the day she was born. She was sipping sweet tea from one of my grandfather's crystal glasses, leaning heavily against her wealthy, entitled white husband, Connor. Connor wore a custom-tailored navy suit and a smug expression that immediately made my blood boil. He adjusted his silk designer tie and stepped forward, invading my personal space with a sneer. "We are liquidating the estate," Aaliyah, Connor said, speaking to me as if I were a slow and uneducated child. "Since you are just a freelance IT tech, we assume you cannot afford rent in a neighborhood like this anyway. Let the adults handle the real money from now on." I stared dead into Connor's arrogant blue eyes. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice. I looked at Kendra, who was hiding a self-satisfied smile behind the rim of her crystal glass. "You are liquidating the estate?" I asked, keeping my tone dangerously calm. "Grandfather Silas barely has his headstone placed over his grave, and you are already measuring the curtains for a real estate sale." My mother stepped forward aggressively, unrolling a loud strip of packing tape. "Do not speak to your brother-in-law that way, Aaliyah," she snapped, pointing the tape dispenser at my face. "Connor is doing us a massive favor by handling the legalities of the estate. He comes from a prominent family and knows exactly how these property transfers work. You have always been completely ignorant about financial matters." We need this house cleared out so the real estate agents can stage it by Monday morning. I let out a sharp, dry laugh. The sheer audacity of her statement echoed in the large kitchen. Connor comes from old money, so he gets to walk into the house my grandfather built with his own 2 hands and throw me out on the street. I looked Connor up and down, noting the slight twitch in his jaw when I questioned his authority. Kendra placed her glass down on the counter with a loud clink. "Stop acting like a victim, Aaliyah," Kendra said, crossing her arms and stepping closer to her husband. "You have been living here rent-free, taking advantage of Grandpa Silas while his health declined. Connor and I are just stepping in to protect the family assets from scavengers. You are lucky we are giving you 30 minutes to gather your junk before we call security to have you physically removed." I took a step toward Kendra, refusing to back down from her fabricated narrative. "I was not taking advantage of anyone, Kendra. I moved in to take care of him because you and Mom refused to visit him when he got sick. I managed his medications. I drove him to his chemotherapy appointments, and I held his hand while he took his last breath. Where were you when he needed protecting then?" Before Kendra could formulate another hypocritical excuse, the kitchen door swung open again. My father Desmond stepped into the room. He wore his sharpest deacon suit, projecting an image of pious authority that fooled everyone in his congregation, but never fooled me. He surveyed the scene, assessing the tension between me and his favorite daughter. He stepped right into my path, physically cutting off my route to the hallway. He pulled his leather wallet from his inner suit pocket and extracted a crumpled $50 bill. He dropped it onto the marble island between us. "Get a cheap motel," he ordered, his voice tight with impatience. "You are upsetting your mother and ruining the repast for our guests. Take your things and leave quietly before I make a scene." I stared at the green bill resting on the marble. I did not reach for it. Instead, I pushed it right back toward his hand, sliding it across the smooth stone. "Keep it," I said, my voice slicing through the heavy kitchen air. "Just like you gave me $50 when you drained my entire college savings account to pay for Kendra's first extravagant wedding. Do you remember that, Dad? You told me I was going to community college anyway, so I did not need the tuition money as much as Kendra needed a Vera Wang gown." My father's jaw tightened, his eyes flashing with sudden, unbridled rage. "How dare you bring up ancient history today?" he hissed, leaning closer so the guests outside the door would not hear. "I made a financial decision for this family. Kendra married into a good family and needed a proper start in life. You were perfectly capable of taking out student loans." "I did take out loans," I fired back, never breaking eye contact. "I worked 3 jobs and paid my own way through school while you funded a massive party for a marriage that lasted exactly 18 months before she divorced him and found Connor. You stole my tuition to buy a celebration for your friends. And now you want to hand me $50 and throw me out of the only home where I ever felt safe. You can keep your charity." My mother stepped in front of my father, her face contorted with fury. "You ungrateful, wretched girl!" Vivian shouted, her voice rising dangerously loud. "We gave you life. We put a roof over your head for 18 years. Grandpa Silas let you stay here because he felt sorry for you, because you could never keep a stable job or find a husband to provide for you. Now his house belongs to us, and we want you gone. If you are not out the front door in 10 minutes, your father will call the local precinct and have you escorted out in handcuffs." The threat of police action hung heavily in the room. I knew my father had friends in the local police department, and I knew he would not hesitate to humiliate me publicly to prove a point. Connor chuckled softly, shaking his head as if he were watching a pathetic reality television show. "My family lawyers will crush you in court if you try to fight this eviction, sweetie," Connor said, his tone dripping with extreme condescension. "You are completely out of your league. You have no legal standing, no money, and no power here. Go back to fixing computers and let the people with actual resources manage the real estate portfolio." The noise of our argument had grown too loud to be contained within the kitchen walls. The swinging door pushed open completely, and a few of the church elders peered inside. Auntie Pearl and Sister Beatrice stood near the doorway, their plates full of food, their eyes wide with morbid curiosity. Instead of stepping back to handle this privately, my family played right to the crowd. Connor took a step forward and physically grabbed my heavy leather laptop bag resting on the stool next to me. Before I could stop him, he marched past the gaping church ladies and hurled my bag out the front door. I watched through the foyer as it landed hard on the wet concrete of the front porch, directly in the pouring rain. My heart raced, but my mind remained absolutely icy. I knew what was inside that bag, and I knew my own strength. I turned my back on my parents without another word. I walked out of the kitchen, passing Auntie Pearl and Sister Beatrice. As I moved through the formal living room, the whispers started rising around me like a swarm of angry bees. She was always the difficult child, Auntie Pearl muttered loudly enough for me to hear. So rebellious and stubborn, never willing to listen to her mother. Sister Beatrice nodded vigorously, adjusting her wide-brimmed funeral hat. Such a shame she could never keep a man like Kendra did. A woman her age with no husband and no real career causing a scene at her own grandfather repast. It is an absolute disgrace to Vivian and Desmond. They are such good Christian people and she just brings them nothing but heartache. I kept my head high, ignoring the poisonous whispers of women who only knew the shiny fake facade my parents presented to the world. I walked out the front door, stepping into the heavy Atlanta rain. The cold water instantly soaked my hair and my simple black dress. I bent down and picked up my laptop bag, brushing the wet leaves off the leather. I walked down the long paved driveway toward my car, refusing to look back at the massive estate. I sat in the driver's seat of my vehicle, watching the rain hit the windshield. I did not cry. I did not panic. I simply reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I opened my messages and selected the contact for Mr. Holloway, my grandfather, private wealth attorney. I typed out a quick, precise message. They took the bait. They think they own the house. Initiate phase 1. I hit send and started the engine. My family thought they had just thrown a broke freelance tech worker out onto the street. They had no idea that the woman they just insulted was the self-made multi-million-dollar CEO of an elite cybersecurity firm. They had no idea that they had just activated a trap that would tear their entire fake world down to the exact foundation. The morning sun glared through the floor-to-ceiling glass walls of my corner office at Sentinel Shield Cybersecurity. I stood at the head of the conference table, watching real-time threat metrics flash across the digital display boards. My lead analyst, Jamal, was breaking down a data breach we had just intercepted for a major logistics client. This was my world. I built this company from a single laptop in a cramped studio apartment into a multi-million-dollar enterprise that secured federal contractors and Fortune 500 corporations. I was not the struggling freelance tech worker my family desperately wanted me to be. I was the CEO. And my phone was currently vibrating off the mahogany desk with an incoming call from David, my private wealth manager at First National Bank. I held up a hand to pause Jamal and answered the call. David sounded breathless and entirely unprofessional, which immediately put me on high alert. He told me that my parents, Vivian and Desmond, had just stormed into the main branch lobby. They were causing a massive scene, demanding that the bank immediately freeze all of my personal and business accounts. David explained that they were loudly accusing me of embezzling hundreds of thousands of dollars from Grandpa Silas during his final months of hospice care. They brought my sister Kendra and her husband Connor with them. David was whispering from his locked office, telling me that Connor was currently threatening to sue the entire bank if they did not comply with my parents' demands. I felt a cold, sharp spike of adrenaline hit my chest. My family had escalated from tossing my bags into the rain to attempting to sever my financial lifeline. They assumed I was still the vulnerable girl they could control with threats and intimidation. I thanked David for the heads up, instructed him to do absolutely nothing until I arrived and ended the call. I grabbed my keys from the desk and told Jamal I had a family emergency to handle. As I took the private elevator down to the parking garage, my mind raced back to the day I turned 18. My father had dragged me to a local branch and forced me to hand over the passwords to my small checking account, claiming he needed to monitor my spending for my own good. I remembered the sickening feeling of checking my balance a week later to find it drained to pay for Kendra new tires. They were trying to play the exact same game today, but the stakes were entirely different. I slid into my car and drove straight toward the financial district. I pushed through the heavy glass doors of the First National Bank branch, and the sound of my mother's shrill voice echoed across the marble lobby. Vivian was standing at the teller counter, dabbing at her dry eyes with a tissue, playing the role of the grieving, traumatized daughter to perfection. Desmond stood beside her, arms crossed, puffing his chest out to intimidate the young security guard who was trying to de-escalate the situation. Kendra was leaning against a leather waiting chair, scrolling on her phone, looking completely bored. And then there was Connor. Connor stood front and center, slamming a thick manila folder against the teller glass. He wore his privilege like a custom-tailored suit, entirely confident that his mere presence as a wealthy white man would force these bank employees into submission. I walked across the lobby, my heels clicking sharply against the marble. The young security guard saw me approach and immediately stepped back, letting out a visible breath of relief. Connor turned around and his smug expression deepened. He stepped directly into my path, holding up a document with a gold seal. "We caught you, Aaliyah," Connor said, his voice dripping with condescension. "We know exactly what you did to that old man. I have a legally binding will right here dated 5 years ago, giving Desmond and Vivian full power of attorney over Silas' estate. You manipulated a dying man and siphoned his cash into your little freelance accounts. My family lawyers have already drafted the injunctions. We are going to freeze every dime you have. You are completely out of your league, sweetie." I did not raise my voice. I did not show an ounce of fear. I stepped around Connor, entirely ignoring his existence, and walked directly up to the head teller counter. David, the branch manager, hurried out of his office looking terrified of the impending legal disaster. I opened my designer bag and pulled out a solid metal black corporate card, tossing it onto the counter. Next to it, I placed a certified federal tax identification document bearing the crest of Sentinel Shield Cybersecurity. I looked at David, pointing to the documents. "Verify the corporate status, David," I commanded. My parents watched in confusion as David scanned the documents, his eyes widening as he pulled up my profile on his monitor. Desmond slammed his hand on the counter right next to my card. "Do not ignore us, Aaliyah. We know you stole from Silas. You have always been a thief and a liar. We are taking back what belongs to this family. You are not walking out of here with a single cent." I turned slowly to face my father. My voice was dangerously calm, echoing perfectly in the quiet lobby. "Those accounts do not belong to you, Dad. They do not belong to Grandpa Silas. Those accounts are federally insured business assets tied to a multi-million-dollar corporation that I own entirely." I looked over at Connor, who was suddenly staring very hard at the heavy black card resting on the counter. His arrogant smirk began to slip. "You brought a country club lawyer to a federal fight, Connor," I said, staring him down. "If you attempt to freeze a corporate account without a federal warrant, you are committing tortious interference with a commercial enterprise. My legal team will not just sue you for damages. We will personally bankrupt you and drag your entire family name through federal court. You want to play lawyer today, Connor? Go ahead, file the injunction. See what happens when you illegally target a firm that handles federal cybersecurity contracts." Connor took a physical step backward, his face paling. He looked at the fake will in his hand and then looked at my federal tax documents. He was a coward playing dress-up, and the moment he realized I had actual power, he folded. He turned to Desmond and muttered that they needed to review their legal strategy before taking further action. Vivienne dropped her tissue, entirely abandoning the weeping mother routine. "What is she talking about, Desmond? What corporation? She is a freelancer. Do not let her talk to you like this. Get the money." To drive the point home, I turned back to the teller. "I need to make a withdrawal," I said clearly. $10,000. Cash. Large bills, please." The teller looked at David, who nodded frantically. Within moments, the teller fed stacks of crisp $100 bills through the counting machine. The mechanical whirring sound filled the silence in the lobby. My parents watched in absolute shock as the teller placed the thick banded stacks of cash on the counter. Desmond's jaw slacked. Vivian stared at the money like she was hallucinating. I picked up the cash, placed it casually into my bag, and retrieved my black card. I looked at my mother and father. "You wanted to evict a failure?" I said, my tone ice cold. "You kicked out a CEO instead. Do not ever follow me to my bank again. If you breathe near my assets, I will press charges for attempted corporate espionage and harassment." I walked out of the bank, leaving them standing frozen in the lobby. The power dynamic had violently shifted, and they had no idea how to handle it. I got back into my car and drove toward my office, feeling the adrenaline slowly recede into sharp, focused clarity. But my family was not done. They were humiliated, cornered, and desperate. And desperate people always resort to public sabotage. By the time I parked my car, my phone was vibrating continuously. Notifications flooded my screen in rapid succession. I opened my social media applications and immediately saw the source of the chaos. Kendra had just posted a 5-minute video to her primary page tagging the entire local church congregation, our extended family, and dozens of community leaders. I clicked play and watched my sister put on the performance of a lifetime. Kendra sat in the front seat of Connor luxury SUV, her perfect makeup artfully smudged to make it look like she had been crying for hours. She spoke directly to the camera, her voice shaking with manufactured grief. "I never thought I would have to make a video like this," she sobbed, wiping a fake tear from her cheek. "But my sister Aaliyah has betrayed our family in the worst way possible. She took advantage of our grandfather Silas while he was dying. She stole his money, and now she is trying to steal the estate that he promised to our parents. Please pray for our family during this incredibly painful time. We are just trying to protect my grandfather's legacy from someone who only cares about greed." The video already had hundreds of comments. The church aunties who had watched me get thrown out of the repast were fueling the fire, leaving aggressive comments about my character. Relatives I had not spoken to in over a decade were sending me direct messages, calling me a thief, a disgrace, and a criminal. My mother shared the video, adding a caption about how heartbroken she was, that the devil had taken hold of her eldest daughter. They were weaponizing their social standing, trying to destroy my reputation in the community so that no one would believe me when the truth finally came out. I sat in my car watching the vitriol pour in. They thought public shame would break me. They thought I would call them begging for forgiveness, begging them to take the video down. Instead, I took screenshots of the posts, the comments, and the shares. I sent them directly to my legal team with instructions to prepare a massive defamation lawsuit. They wanted to play dirty in public, and I was going to make sure the consequences were legally devastating. My phone rang, cutting through the endless stream of notification chimes. The caller ID displayed Mr. Holloway's name. I answered immediately, taking a deep breath to steady my voice. "Aaliyah." Mr. Holloway said, his tone completely devoid of his usual pleasantries. "I need you to come to my office right now. The paperwork for the $25 million trust is finalized and fully certified by the probate judge. But that is not why I'm calling you." I gripped the steering wheel. "What is wrong?" "Silas left something else for you," Mr. Holloway explained, his voice dropping to a serious, hushed tone. "He gave me a sealed lockbox 2 weeks before he passed. He instructed me to hand it directly to you the moment your parents attempted to contest the estate. There is a ledger inside Aaliyah, a very old, very detailed financial ledger." My brow furrowed in confusion. "A ledger for what?" Mr. Holloway let out a heavy sigh. "It is a confession, Aaliyah. Silas discovered exactly why your parents have treated you with such hostility your entire life. It is not just favoritism toward Kendra. It is something much darker. You need to get here immediately." I ended the call and started the engine, pulling out of the parking garage and speeding directly toward the downtown legal district. The viral video, the bank confrontation, the eviction, they were all just surface-level distractions. The real war was waiting for me in that sealed lockbox, and I was finally going to uncover the truth they had spent 35 years burying. I pushed through the heavy revolving glass doors of the First National Bank branch in downtown Atlanta. The air conditioning hit my face, carrying the familiar scent of polished marble and expensive leather. The lobby was usually a place of quiet transactions and hushed professionalism, but today the atmosphere was completely shattered. I did not even have to look for my family. I could hear my mother Vivian from all the way across the expansive room. She was standing directly in front of the main teller counter, projecting her voice so that every single customer and employee could hear her manufactured grief. She dabbed at her dry eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief, playing the role of the traumatized daughter who had just been robbed by her own flesh and blood. My father Desmond stood right beside her with his chest puffed out, in that familiar aggressive posture he always used to intimidate people who were just trying to do their jobs. He was currently pointing a thick finger at David, the branch manager, who was standing behind the counter, looking completely panicked. But it was Connor who was truly orchestrating the circus. My sister Kendra's husband stood front and center wearing a custom-tailored navy suit that I knew for a fact he had bought on credit. He held a thick manila folder in one hand and was slapping a document against the glass partition with the other. He leaned forward using his height and his perceived status as a wealthy white man to bully David into submission. Connor spoke with the absolute unearned confidence of someone who had never been told no in his entire life. "We caught you, Aaliyah!" Connor's voice rang out sharp and triumphant the moment he saw me approaching. He turned away from the teller window and stepped directly into my path, blocking my way. His arrogant blue eyes traced up and down my simple black dress, looking at me like I was a desperate criminal who had just walked right into his trap. "We know exactly what you did to that old man. I have a legally binding will right here dated 5 years ago, giving Desmond and Vivian full power of attorney over Silas and his entire estate. You manipulated a dying man and you siphoned his cash into your little freelance bank accounts." I stopped walking, maintaining a deliberate distance between us. I did not raise my voice. I did not show a single ounce of panic. I simply looked at the piece of paper he was waving in my face. Even from 2 feet away, I could see the document was a generic internet template. There was no official court seal, and the signature at the bottom looked nothing like my grandfather Silas and his precise, flowing handwriting. It was a pathetic forgery created by desperate people. "My family lawyers have already drafted the injunctions." Connor continued, taking another step toward me to invade my personal space. "We are going to freeze every dime you have. You are completely out of your league, sweetie. My family will crush you in court. You are going to leave this bank with absolutely nothing, and you will be lucky if we do not press federal charges for elder abuse." My father Desmond stepped up next to Connor, nodding his head in stern agreement. "You have always been a thief and a liar, Aaliyah." Desmond said, his voice dropping into the harsh, judgmental tone that had haunted my entire childhood. "We are taking back what rightfully belongs to this family. You are not walking out of here with a single cent. You are going to hand over the access to those accounts right now, or I will personally ensure you spend the next 10 years behind bars." Vivienne dropped her handkerchief, entirely abandoning her weeping mother routine the second she saw me. Her eyes were wide and manic with greed. "Tell the manager to hand over the funds, Aaliyah," Vivian demanded, pointing a sharp acrylic nail at my face. "You owe us this money. We raised you. We put a roof over your head. You owe us for every meal you ate and every piece of clothing you wore. Give Connor the authorization right now." I stared at the three of them, a trinity of absolute delusion. I did not argue with them. I did not try to defend my character or explain how I had paid for my own life since the day I turned 18. Arguing with a narcissist is a waste of oxygen, and I was not here to debate. I was here to execute. I stepped around Connor, entirely ignoring his existence, and walked directly up to the counter where David was standing. David looked at me with a mixture of intense relief and absolute terror. He knew exactly who I was, and he knew exactly how much capital my firm held in this institution. "David," I said, my voice perfectly level and commanding, "I need you to verify the corporate status on my primary accounts immediately." I reached into my designer bag and pulled out my corporate card. It was not standard plastic. It was a heavy, solid metal black card that landed on the marble counter with a dense, authoritative thud. The sound was sharp enough to make Connor blink and take a slight step back. Next to the card, I placed a certified federal tax identification document bearing the crest of Sentinel Shield Cybersecurity, the elite firm I had built from the ground up. My parents watched in utter confusion. They were so convinced I was still a struggling freelance tech worker that they could not comprehend what they were looking at. David immediately picked up the metal card, his hands shaking slightly as he swiped it through his terminal and cross-referenced the federal tax identification number. The screen in front of him illuminated with the full profile of my corporate holdings. "What is she talking about, Desmond?" Vivian shrieked, her voice pitching higher as she realized the situation was rapidly slipping out of their control. "What corporation? She is a freelancer. Do not let her talk to you like this. Make the manager freeze the money." Connor tried to recover his dominant posture. He slammed his hand on the counter next to my documents. "I am telling you to freeze those assets right now." Connor barked at David. "I am a representative of the estate, and I demand you comply with this legal document." I turned slowly to face Connor. The absolute silence in the lobby amplified every word I spoke. "Those accounts do not belong to you, Connor," I said, locking my eyes onto his. "They do not belong to my father, and they certainly do not belong to my grandfather, Silas. Those accounts are federally insured business assets tied to a multi-million-dollar corporation that I own entirely." I watched the blood drain from Connor's face as the reality of my words hit him. He looked down at the heavy black card and then up at the federal tax document. The smug confidence that had radiated from him just 2 minutes ago evaporated completely. "My accounts are federally insured under my corporation." I continued stepping closer to him, forcing him to look me in the eye. "You brought a country club lawyer to a federal fight, Connor. If you attempt to freeze a corporate account without a federal warrant, you are committing tortious interference with a commercial enterprise. My legal team will not just sue you for damages. We will personally bankrupt you and drag your entire family name through federal court. You want to play lawyer today, Connor? Go ahead, file the injunction. See what happens when you illegally target a firm that handles federal cybersecurity contracts." Connor opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He looked at the fake will in his hand as if it had suddenly caught fire. He knew he was outmatched. He knew his empty threats held absolutely no weight against federal corporate law. He turned to Desmond and muttered something under his breath about needing to review their legal strategy before taking further action. He was retreating like the coward he truly was. To drive the point home and secure their total humiliation, I turned back to the teller window. David was watching me with wide eyes, waiting for my next instruction. "I need to make a cash withdrawal, David," I said clearly, ensuring my parents heard every single syllable. $10,000, large bills, please." David nodded frantically and signaled the head teller. Within moments, the teller pulled a stack of crisp $100 bills from the secure drawer and began feeding them through the automatic counting machine. The rapid mechanical whirring sound filled the dead silence of the lobby. It was the sound of absolute, undeniable power. My parents watched in paralyzed shock. Desmond's jaw physically dropped. Vivian stared at the counting machine like she was hallucinating, her eyes tracking every $100 bill that flicked through the mechanism. They had come here to strip me of everything, and instead, they were being forced to watch me casually withdraw more money than my father made in a month. The teller gathered the counted bills, wrapped them in 2 neat paper bands, and placed them on the marble counter right in front of me. The physical manifestation of my wealth sat there, separating me from the people who had always called me a failure. I picked up the heavy stacks of cash, placed them casually into my bag, alongside my federal documents, and retrieved my black metal card. I turned to look at my mother and father one last time. They looked small, pathetic, and entirely broken by their own greed. "You wanted to destroy a failure," I said, my voice ice cold and perfectly steady. "You picked a fight with a CEO instead. Do not ever follow me to my bank again. If you breathe near my assets, I will press charges for attempted corporate espionage and federal harassment." I turned my back on them and walked toward the exit. The sound of my heels echoed through the silent lobby, a steady, confident rhythm that marked my victory. I pushed through the heavy revolving glass doors, stepping back out into the humid Atlanta air. I left them standing there, humiliated, speechless, and completely powerless. They had thought they could ambush me in public and bend me to their will. Instead, they had just received their first hard lesson in what happens when you underestimate someone who has nothing left to lose and everything to protect. As I navigated through the busy downtown traffic, my mind was already moving 3 steps ahead of them. The adrenaline was slowly receding, leaving behind a sharp, focused clarity. My parents were not smart, but they were desperate. Desmond would not accept this public humiliation gracefully. He would view my success not as something to be proud of, but as a direct threat to his authority as the patriarch of the family. He would go back to his church elders and spin a new narrative, painting me as a ruthless corporate monster who had stolen her wealth through deceit. Vivian would cry to anyone who would listen, claiming I had abandoned my family the moment I got rich. And Connor would be frantically calling his shady creditors, trying to buy himself more time now that his plan to steal my grandfather's estate had completely imploded in the bank lobby. They were cornered animals, and cornered animals were dangerous. I knew they would retaliate. They would try to destroy my reputation in the community because public perception was the only currency they actually possessed. But I was ready for them. Every move they made from this point forward would only tighten the snare I was building around them. I gripped the steering wheel, feeling the solid weight of the $10,000 sitting in the passenger seat next to me. The cash was just a prop, a theatrical tool used to break their confidence. The real power was the information I held and the resources I commanded. I drove toward my office headquarters, ready to lock down my digital perimeters and prepare for their next desperate strike. The drive from First National Bank to the downtown headquarters of Sentinel Shield Cybersecurity took exactly 14 agonizing minutes. I used every single second of that commute to lock my emotions away inside a cold, impenetrable steel vault. I gripped the leather steering wheel of my car until my knuckles turned white, focusing solely on the steady rhythm of the Atlanta traffic to keep my mind sharp. By the time I pulled into my reserved executive parking space and swiped my encrypted keycard at the heavy glass doors of my firm, I was no longer a daughter who had just been disowned and threatened by her own flesh and blood. I was a chief executive officer preparing for absolute war. My lead threat analyst, Jamal, met me in the sleek, minimalist lobby before I even reached the private elevator bay leading to my corner office. He held a silver tablet tight against his chest, and his expression was grim. He did not offer a greeting. He simply told me that I needed to see something immediately, because my name was currently triggering massive anomaly alerts across our social media monitoring algorithms. I walked past him, dropping my designer bag containing the $10,000 in cash onto my massive mahogany desk and took the tablet directly from his hands. My younger sister Kendra filled the high-definition screen. She was sitting in the passenger seat of Connor luxury SUV parked somewhere that looked intentionally bleak and gray. Her hair, which was usually styled to absolute perfection, was deliberately messy. Her expensive makeup was artfully smudged underneath her eyes, to give the very convincing illusion that she had been weeping hysterically for hours. She was staring directly into the camera lens, and her voice trembled with a perfectly rehearsed manufactured devastation that made my stomach turn. "I never thought I would ever have to make a public video like this," Kendra sobbed, wiping a fake tear from her cheek with a trembling finger. "But my older sister Aaliyah has betrayed our family in the absolute worst way imaginable. She took advantage of our grandfather Silas while he was dying of cancer. She isolated him from us. She manipulated his daily medications to confuse him. She stole his hard-earned money, and now she is actively trying to steal the historic estate that he legally promised to our parents. Please, I am begging you to pray for our family during this incredibly painful time. We are just trying to protect my grandfather's beautiful legacy from someone who only cares about greed and destruction." Jamal reached over and pointed silently to the engagement metrics scrolling rapidly at the bottom of the screen. The video had been live for less than 45 minutes, and it already had over 80,000 views. This was not organic, viral growth. Connor had clearly leveraged his wealthy social connections and paid thousands of dollars for targeted local algorithm boosting. The video was specifically geo-fenced to hit every single feed in our affluent Atlanta suburb. It was precisely aimed at the massive congregation of my father megachurch, the local country club members, and our entire extended family network across Georgia. They had engineered a digital bomb designed to obliterate my character before I even had a chance to speak in my own defense. My personal cell phone began to vibrate violently against the polished wood of my desk, buzzing like an angry hornet. I picked it up to find my lock screen completely drowning in notifications. Direct messages, text messages, and furious voicemails poured in like a toxic, relentless flood. Auntie Pearl left a venomous voice note calling me a Jezebel, a thief, and a disgrace to the bloodline. Cousin Marcus sent a blistering text saying I was permanently dead to the family and that Grandpa Silas was actively rolling in his grave because of my greed. Sister Beatrice, the biggest gossip in the church, commented on Kendra post tagging 50 other prominent congregation members and publicly demanded that the Atlanta Police Department arrest me for felony elder abuse. Even my own mother, Vivian, had shared the video directly to her primary page. She added a long, dramatic caption detailing how her motherly heart was shattered into a million pieces because the devil himself had taken firm hold of her eldest daughter. They were intentionally weaponizing their pristine social standing. They were attempting to burn my reputation to the ground so that when the actual truth finally came out, no one in Atlanta would believe a single word I said. They thought public shame would break me into a million pieces. They firmly believed I would call my father in tears, begging for his forgiveness, pleading with him to take the video down in exchange for handing over my grandfather's estate. They wanted me to surrender my power. I looked at Jamal and handed the silver tablet back to him. I felt absolutely nothing but cold, sharp precision. I did not shed a single tear. I did not scream or panic. I told Jamal to pull every available server resource we had and archive the entire digital footprint of Kendra Post immediately. I ordered him to capture every single comment, every malicious share, every threatening direct message, and every IP address associated with the paid boosting Connor had utilized. I wanted full forensic data extraction, ready for a federal judge to review. They wanted to play dirty in the court of public opinion, but I was preparing to slaughter them in federal court. I instructed my legal department to begin drafting a defamation and libel lawsuit so massive it would bankrupt Connor 10 times over and seize whatever pathetic assets he actually owned. Just as Jamal rushed out of my office to execute the strict containment protocol, my private secured landline rang. It was a restricted number. I picked up the heavy receiver and pressed it firmly to my ear, anticipating bad news. It was Mr. Holloway, my grandfather, private wealth attorney. His voice lacked any of his usual warm, comforting Southern charm. He sounded breathless, tight, and completely rigid with tension. "Aaliyah," Mr. Holloway said, skipping the pleasantries entirely. "I need you to come down to my office right now. The paperwork for your $25 million trust has just been finalized and fully certified by the probate judge. The money is legally and irrevocably yours. But that is not why I am calling you on a secured line." I gripped the edge of my desk, my knuckles turning white. "What is wrong, Mr. Holloway?" "Silas left something else behind for you," Mr. Holloway explained, his voice dropping to a harsh, urgent whisper. He gave me a heavy sealed lockbox exactly 2 weeks before he took his last breath. He explicitly instructed me to open it and hand the contents directly to you the very moment your parents attempted to contest the estate or freeze your assets. There is a ledger inside, Aaliyah. A very old, very detailed physical financial ledger written entirely in your grandfather's own hand. My brow furrowed in deep confusion. A ledger for what? I already have all of his banking records. Mr. Holloway let out a heavy, shaky sigh that echoed through the phone line. "It is a full confession, Aaliyah. Silas discovered exactly why your parents have treated you with such vicious, unyielding hostility your entire life. It is not just about them blindly favoring Kendra over you. It is something much darker, and it involves federal crimes. You need to get to my office right now." I pushed open the heavy oak doors to Arthur Holloway Private Suite on the 40th floor. The Atlanta skyline stretched out behind him through the expansive glass windows, but neither of us cared about the view. Arthur stood behind his polished desk, looking every bit the ruthless litigator Silas had trusted for 4 decades. He did not offer me a drink or ask about the viral video currently tearing through the local internet. He simply pushed a thick, leather-bound portfolio across the smooth wood surface of his desk. "Open it, Aaliyah," Arthur instructed, his voice echoing in the quiet room. "That is the only legal court-certified last will and testament of Silas Vance." I opened the heavy cover and stared at the crisp legal parchment. My eyes scanned the dense paragraphs of legal phrasing until I reached the asset distribution schedule. I read the numbers once, and then I read them again. My breath caught in my throat. Silas had not just left me a small nest egg. He had transferred his entire empire to my name. The document explicitly outlined a $25 million liquid cash trust. It legally transferred full ownership of the historic Atlanta estate, the very same house my parents had gleefully thrown me out of. Below that was a comprehensive list of his commercial real estate portfolio, containing prime downtown office buildings and lucrative retail spaces. Every single asset, every bank account, and every property was designated solely and irrevocably to me. There was a specific clause at the bottom of the page, highlighted in bold ink. I read it aloud, my voice barely above a whisper. "To my daughter Vivian and her husband Desmond, I leave absolutely nothing. I do this with full knowledge and sound mind because I know exactly what they are." Arthur stepped around his desk and stood beside me. "Silas knew they were vultures, Aaliyah. He spent the last 5 years of his life quietly structuring these trusts so that your parents could not touch a single cent. He knew Desmond would try to forge documents. He knew Vivian would play the grieving victim. That is why we secured everything in a blind corporate trust before he even entered hospice care. The money has been safe for months. They have been fighting over an empty checking account." I stared at the signature at the bottom of the page. It was authentic, precise, and undeniably my grandfather. But the sheer magnitude of the inheritance did not explain the sheer panic in Arthur's voice on the phone. I looked up at him. "You mentioned a lockbox, Arthur. You said something about federal crimes." Arthur's expression hardened. He walked over to a concealed wall safe behind a landscape painting, typed in a digital code, and retrieved a heavy steel lockbox. He placed it on the desk between us and handed me a small brass key. "Silas gave me this 2 weeks before he passed," Arthur explained. "He made me swear on my career that I would only give it to you if your parents escalated their attacks to public sabotage. He wanted to protect you from the truth for as long as possible, but he knew Desmond and Vivian would eventually force your hand." I inserted the brass key into the lock. It turned with a sharp mechanical click. I opened the heavy steel lid. Inside, resting on top of a stack of yellowed banking records, was a weathered leather-bound ledger and a handwritten letter sealed in an envelope with my name on it. I picked up the letter and broke the seal. The familiar, elegant handwriting of my grandfather filled the pages. "My dearest Aaliyah," Silas wrote, "if you are reading this, it means your parents have declared war on you. I spent my final years trying to shield you from the darkness in our family, but you need the truth now to defend yourself. You have always wondered why Vivian and Desmond treated you with such unyielding hostility while treating Kendra like royalty. You thought it was simply because you were different or because you challenged their authority. The reality is far more sinister. You were never just a daughter to them, Aaliyah. You were their shield against federal prison." My hands began to shake slightly as I read the next paragraph. "When you were just 6 years old, Desmond Business Ventures went completely bankrupt. He owed millions to creditors, and the federal government was preparing to audit his remaining assets. To hide his embezzled money and avoid federal tax evasion charges, Desmond and your mother used your social security number. They set up dozens of offshore shell companies and fraudulent credit lines entirely in your name. They funneled millions of dollars of illegal income through your identity." I dropped the letter onto the desk, my heart hammering against my ribs. I looked at the weathered ledger in the box. I pulled it out and opened it. The pages were filled with decades of detailed financial tracking. Silas had meticulously documented every single fraudulent transaction, every fake corporate filing, and every illegal wire transfer my parents had executed using my childhood identity. "They hated you," Silas' letter continued, "because you were a walking, breathing liability to them. Every time you succeeded, every time you showed independence or financial intelligence, it terrified them. They were petrified that you would eventually run a background check or trigger a federal audit that would uncover the massive web of financial crimes attached to your social security number. They kept you down, marginalized, and emotionally broken so that you would never have the confidence or the resources to look into your own financial history. Kendra was the golden child simply because her record was clean. She was their safe bet. You were their scapegoat. The realization hit me with the force of a freight train. The decades of emotional abuse, the constant screaming matches the way they relentlessly belittled my tech career and mocked my ambitions. It was never about me being a difficult child. It was a calculated psychological campaign to keep me subservient and blind to the fact that they had committed massive federal identity theft against their own daughter. I spent the last 3 years quietly unraveling their mess, Silas wrote. I used my own wealth to silently pay off the hidden liabilities and clear your name with the federal authorities before they could officially indict you. Your record is completely clean now, Aaliyah, but Desmond and Vivian do not know that. They believe the federal government is finally closing in on them. They are completely broke and drowning in debt. That is why they are so desperate to seize my estate. They need my millions to pay off the ghost accounts before the authorities knock on their door. I stared at Arthur, who was watching me with a mixture of profound sorrow and absolute professional readiness. The fake Will Connor brought to the bank. I said, my voice dangerously calm as the pieces rapidly clicked together. It was not just basic greed. They are trying to steal the estate to cover their tracks. Exactly, Arthur said, nodding sharply. Connor is in on it. His so-called successful investments are tanking, and he is complicit in their recent wire fraud. They orchestrated this entire public spectacle with Kendra Video to force you into a settlement. They thought if they publicly humiliated you and accused you of elder abuse, you would gladly hand over the estate just to make the nightmare go away. They need that $25 million to stay out of federal prison. I looked down at the ledger. It was a literal roadmap of my parents' betrayal. They had traded my future for their comfort. They had weaponized their community standing and leveraged the church to destroy my reputation, all while hiding behind a facade of righteous Christian parenting. They wanted to paint me as the villain to the entire city of Atlanta. Arthur, I said, placing my hands flat on the desk. I want the $25 million transferred into my primary corporate holding account by the end of the hour. I want the deeds to the Atlanta estate and the commercial properties filed and secured. Done, Arthur said, stepping back to his computer terminal. What do you want to do about the ledger? I picked up the heavy leather book. The texture of it felt like solid ammunition in my hands. I thought about Kendra fake tears on that viral video. I thought about my mother sharing the post and calling me a demon. I thought about the church aunties leaving hateful comments demanding my arrest. They had built a massive public stage to execute my character. Now I was going to use that exact same stage to end them. Call my legal team at Sentinel Shield. I commanded, my voice entirely devoid of hesitation. Tell them to drop the defamation lawsuit. We are not suing them for slander, Arthur. Arthur paused, his hands hovering over his keyboard. He looked confused. We are not suing them. No, I said, a cold, hard smile spreading across my face. Suing them gives them a chance to settle out of court. Suing them keeps it civil. I want you to take this ledger and immediately hand it over to our contacts at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We are going to submit a formal portfolio for aggravated identity theft, federal wire fraud, and tax evasion. They want to call me a criminal in front of the whole world. Let us see how they handle a federal raid on their pristine suburban mansion. Arthur did not immediately reach for his phone to contact the federal authorities. Instead, he placed his hands flat on his polished mahogany desk and looked at me with a solemn, steady gaze. He agreed completely with my decision to bypass civil litigation and go straight for a federal indictment, but he insisted I review the specific contents of the ledger first. I needed to understand the exact anatomy of the fraud to fully comprehend why Connor had been sweating with desperation in the bank lobby. I pulled the heavy, dusty ledger closer to me. The thick leather cover was worn at the edges, and the pages carried the distinct dry scent of old paper and permanent ink. I turned to the first section marked with a crisp red tab. The entry was dated exactly 15 years ago. I was barely 20 years old at the time, working 3 exhausting jobs to pay for my own cybersecurity coding certifications because my parents claimed they were entirely too broke to help me. According to the meticulous handwriting of my grandfather, they were not broke. They had just secured a massive illegal commercial loan using my social security number as the primary guarantor. But the money did not go toward paying off Desmond's failing business debts as I might have assumed. I ran my finger down the column of numbers. The ledger detailed a highly organized series of wire transfers. $50,000 for Kendra luxury European vacation. $80,000 for a down payment on a customized imported vehicle registered entirely in Kendra's name. My parents had systematically hijacked my financial identity to fund my sister and her lavish lifestyle. Every designer bag, every extravagant trip, every single time Kendra had mocked my cheap clothes or my relentless work ethic, she was literally wearing stolen goods bought with my hijacked credit. I turned the page, and the betrayal deepened into something far more sinister. There was a dedicated section detailing financial transactions from 5 years ago. This was right around the time Kendra married Connor. Connor had always touted himself as a self-made tech entrepreneur. My parents worshipped his supposed business acumen, constantly comparing his fabricated success to my legitimate cybersecurity firm. The ledger told the real story. Connor Tech's startup had been a catastrophic failure. He was bleeding cash and facing massive investor lawsuits for mismanaging funds. To save their golden son-in-law and protect the family image, Desmond and Vivian had used my stolen identity to secure a high-interest commercial bailout loan. They funneled hundreds of thousands of dollars into Connor's failing company to keep him afloat. Connor knew, I said, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper cutting through the quiet office. He knew his entire empire was built on my stolen identity. Arthur nodded grimly, adjusting his glasses. He knew everything, Aaliyah. That is exactly why he was at the bank today, waving that forged will in your face. He was not just trying to steal Silas' estate. He was trying to seize immediate control of your personal assets before you discovered the truth. He needed to freeze your accounts so you would never find the paper trail connecting him to the identity fraud. I stared at the pages, feeling a cold, sharp rage replacing the initial shock. Silas had spent the last month of his life uncovering this massive conspiracy. The ledger documented how Silas discovered the fraud through a careless banking error Desmond made while trying to shift funds. Silas immediately hired independent forensic accountants to trace the money. What he found was terrifying. The Internal Revenue Service had finally caught on to the glaring financial irregularities. The federal government was preparing to freeze my legitimate corporate accounts at Sentinel Shield Cybersecurity and indict me for massive federal tax evasion and wire fraud. I would have been arrested, stripped of my firm, and sent to federal prison for crimes my parents committed in my name. Silas did not confront them. He knew Desmond would simply destroy the evidence and leave me to take the fall. Instead, my grandfather quietly liquidated a massive portion of his hidden commercial assets. He paid off the IRS in full, settling the fraudulent debts and clearing my name completely. He paid millions of dollars to keep me out of federal prison, all while keeping Desmond and Vivian completely in the dark. He gathered every single piece of damning evidence, every forged signature, every illegal wire transfer, and every offshore account routing number. He bound them all inside this dusty leather ledger, creating a watertight prosecution file. He handed me the loaded weapon they had aimed at my head. I closed the ledger. The heavy thud of the cover echoed in the room. The pieces of the puzzle were now fully assembled. My parents did not just favor Kendra. They viewed me as collateral damage in their pursuit of unearned wealth. They had actively planned to let me rot in a federal cell so they could maintain their country club facade. "Make the call, Arthur," I commanded, my tone leaving absolutely no room for debate. "Send the digital copies of this ledger directly to my contacts at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We are going to bypass the local Atlanta authorities entirely. I want federal agents knocking on Desmond's door before the sun goes down today." Arthur picked up his phone and began dialing his legal team to coordinate the data transfer. As he spoke in hushed, rapid tones, my own cell phone vibrated sharply against the desk. The caller ID displayed Jamal name. I answered immediately, knowing my lead analyst would only call my personal line if the situation had escalated. "We have a massive problem," Aliyah Jamal said, his voice tight with urgency. "The containment protocol on Kendra video is running, but they just escalated the attack." "What did they do, Jamal?" I asked, grabbing my car keys. "Connor just went live on a local news network." Jamal explained, the sound of rapid typing echoing in the background. "He is standing outside your grandfather's historic estate right now. He brought a local news crew with him. He is publicly claiming that you illegally changed the locks on the property, and he is demanding the police force entry to protect the family assets you supposedly stole. He is trying to break into the estate on live television." I ended the call and stood up, sliding the heavy ledger securely into my bag. Connor was desperate and incredibly stupid. He was trying to force a physical confrontation to gain public sympathy before his financial crimes caught up with him. He wanted a theatrical show, and I was going to give him a devastating finale. "Keep filing the federal report, Arthur," I said, heading toward the heavy oak doors of his office. "I am going directly to the estate. It is time to physically evict them from my property." Before I closed the heavy leather cover of the ledger entirely, my eyes caught a second section marked with a crisp red tab. I paused, my hand hovering over the worn pages. The heading at the top of the parchment was written in my grandfather's precise flowing script. It simply read, "Connor." I sat back down in the leather chair opposite Arthur Holloway and flipped the page. I thought I had already uncovered the absolute bottom of my family depravity, but I was entirely wrong. Silas had not just hired forensic accountants to track my parents' federal identity fraud. He had hired elite private investigators to look into the man Kendra had married. Connor had always presented himself to Atlanta high society as the ultimate catch. He wore bespoke suits, drove imported luxury vehicles, and spoke with a manufactured patrician drawl that practically screamed generational wealth. He claimed to be the heir to a massive Charleston shipping fortune and touted himself as a self-made tech entrepreneur. My parents absolutely worshipped the ground he walked on. They constantly compared his fabricated success to my legitimate cybersecurity firm, using him as the ultimate standard of perfection. The ledger revealed the pathetic, staggering truth. Connor was a complete and utter fraud. According to the private investigation reports bound in the ledger, his family had formally disowned him 7 years ago. He had been caught embezzling hundreds of thousands of dollars from a trust fund set up for his younger sister. His family quietly cut him off legally, severing all ties and ensuring he would never see a single cent of their actual wealth. Connor had arrived in Atlanta completely broke, operating entirely on maxed-out credit cards and sheer arrogance. He targeted Kendra because she was an easy mark. Kendra was desperate for a trophy husband to parade in front of our father megachurch congregation. Desmond and Vivian were equally desperate for a wealthy elite son-in-law to cement their social standing at the local country club. Connor married my sister firmly believing that my parents were loaded. My parents welcomed Connor into the family firmly believing they had secured a billionaire. It was a spectacular collision of mutual parasites, I said, my voice tight with disbelief as I read the investigator notes aloud to Arthur. Each side was completely convinced they were scamming the other. Arthur adjusted his glasses, leaning over the desk to look at the documents. "It gets worse, Aliyah. Look at the financial disclosures from his so-called tech startup." I turned to the next page and felt a cold, sharp spike of adrenaline. Connor Tech Company was not just a failure. It was a catastrophic financial black hole. He had leveraged his fake status to secure massive loans, but he had not gone to traditional banks. Traditional banks require actual collateral. Connor had gone to unregulated shadow lenders. He had borrowed money from an aggressive private equity syndicate operating out of Miami. The kind of creditors who do not care about your credit score, but care very much about broken kneecaps and physical retaliation. He owed them $2 million. The ledger contained intercepted emails and copies of threatening text messages sent to Connor burner phone. The interest was compounding daily. He was missing payments. The syndicate was actively threatening to seize his assets and publicly humiliate him. This explains everything, I murmured, my eyes scanning the terrifying numbers. When Connor realized his life was essentially in danger, he must have finally confessed his massive debt to my father. And Desmond did not throw him out? Arthur finished the thought, his face grim. Because Desmond could not afford the public humiliation. Exactly, I said, the sick reality of their dynamic crystallizing in my mind. Desmond is a narcissist. His entire identity is built on his image as a successful patriarch. If the church congregation or the country club board found out that Kendra married a broke criminal fraud, the family reputation would be permanently destroyed. Desmond would rather commit federal crimes than face public embarrassment. I looked back down at the ledger where Silas had outlined my father's desperate contingency plan. Desmond had promised Connor they would use my grandfather's estate to pay off the $2 million debt. They thought Silas was just a wealthy old man who would leave his money to his only daughter. When they realized Silas was leaving the entire empire to me, they panicked. That is why Connor was screaming at the bank manager today, I said, leaning back in the chair. That is why they forged the will and tried to freeze my corporate accounts. Connor was not just being his usual arrogant self, he was literally fighting for his life. If he does not get his hands on that $25 million cash trust, his creditors are going to destroy him. They are cornered rats, Arthur said, shaking his head in absolute disgust. They are willing to sacrifice your freedom, your business, and your entire future just to maintain a fake image of perfection. Silas knew they were planning this. He paid off your IRS debts to keep you out of federal prison, and he compiled this ledger to ensure you had the weapon you needed to execute them. I closed the heavy ledger and ran my hand over the embossed leather cover. The sheer audacity of their entitlement was breathtaking. They had traded my safety for their comfort. They had weaponized their community standing and leveraged the church to destroy my reputation, all while hiding behind a facade of righteous Christian parenting. They wanted to paint me as the villain to the entire city of Atlanta to distract from their own massive financial crimes. My personal cell phone suddenly buzzed against the polished wood of Arthur's desk, cutting through the heavy silence of the office. I picked it up, expecting another hateful message from an extended relative who had seen Kendra fake crying video. Instead, the notification was a mass group text message. I opened the application and saw that Vivian had just broadcast a message to over 500 people. She had included the entire megachurch congregation directory, the local country club mailing list, and dozens of prominent Atlanta society influencers. I read the text message out loud, my voice steady and cold. Join us this Saturday evening at the historic Vance Estate for an exclusive gala celebrating the launch of the new Silas Legacy Foundation. Hosted by Kendra and Connor, with special remarks from Desmond and Vivian. Formal attire requested as we honor our beloved patriarch and protect his true legacy. Arthur stared at me, his jaw dropping slightly. Are they insane? They are throwing a massive party in a house they do not legally own, using funds they do not possess to celebrate a fake foundation while owing $2 million to loan sharks. It is a classic narcissistic deflection tactic, I explained, tossing my phone onto the desk. If they throw an incredibly expensive, highly public party, no one in their social circle will question their wealth. They are trying to establish facts on the ground. They think if they act like they own the estate, the community will force me to hand it over to avoid a public scandal. They are doubling down on the delusion. Arthur reached for his office phone, his professional instincts kicking into overdrive. I am calling the federal authorities right now, Aaliyah. We will have the FBI raid that house before they can even set up the catering tents. We can shut this entire circus down tonight. Wait, I said, holding up my hand to stop him. Arthur paused, his hand hovering over the receiver. Why would we wait? You have everything you need to send them to federal prison. I looked down at the mass text message glowing on my screen and then looked back up at Arthur. A slow, lethal smile spread across my face. Because arresting them quietly in the middle of the night gives them the opportunity to play the victim, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous focused register. Vivian and Desmond care about their public image more than they care about their own children. Connor cares about looking like a billionaire more than he cares about breathing. They want a massive audience. They want all their wealthy friends and church elders gathered in one place to celebrate their fake victory. I stood up and picked up the heavy ledger, sliding it carefully into my designer bag next to the $10,000 in cash. "Let them throw the party," Arthur, I said, looking out at the sprawling Atlanta skyline. "Let them invite every single person they know. Let Connor put on his custom-tailored suit and let Kendra pretend she is a billionaire heiress. Do not file the federal injunctions until Saturday night. Let them build their perfect stage. We are going to walk right through the front doors of that gala, and we are going to serve the consequences." I left Arthur's office with the leather ledger safely secured in my bag and drove straight back to the downtown headquarters of Sentinel Shield. I did not wait for Saturday to begin my offensive. Vivian and Desmond wanted to play a high-stakes game of optics and illusion, but they fundamentally misunderstood the board we were playing on. They operated on social capital country club gossip and church politics. I operated on data algorithms and absolute digital supremacy. By the time I walked into my corner office, my mind was entirely clear. I was no longer the wounded daughter reacting to their cruelty. I was a chief executive officer orchestrating a hostile takeover. Jamal was already waiting for me when I pushed through my glass doors. I bypassed the usual pleasantries and placed a customized encrypted flash drive on the smooth mahogany surface of my desk. I had spent 15 minutes in my car photographing the specific offshore routing numbers and shell company names listed in my grandfather ledger. I pushed the drive toward Jamal and instructed him to unleash our firm's most aggressive tracking software. Sentinel Shield handled corporate cybersecurity for major financial institutions across the globe. We had the legal clearance and the technological firepower to track digital money through the darkest corners of the internet. I told Jamal to build a watertight digital dossier that matched the physical evidence in Silas' ledger. I wanted a full forensic map of every remaining ghost account, every offshore wire transfer, and every fraudulent credit line my parents had opened using my social security number. I needed irrefutable digital proof that Desmond and Vivian had committed massive federal identity theft, ready to be handed directly to a federal prosecutor. Jamal did not ask a single question. He saw the lethal focus in my eyes, grabbed the drive, and immediately went to work marshaling our top analysts for the hunt. With my parents' financial history currently being dissected and archived, I turned my attention to my arrogant brother-in-law. The ledger had provided the exact name of the unregulated Miami private equity syndicate holding Connor $2 million debt. Connor believed he was playing a brilliant survival game by marrying into my family and plotting to steal my grandfather's estate. He strutted around Atlanta in bespoke suits, acting like an apex predator, when in reality he was just a desperate cornered animal bleeding cash. He thought he was outsmarting everyone. I was about to remind him that there was always a bigger fish. I picked up my secured landline and called Arthur Holloway back. I instructed him to immediately establish a blind proxy holding company registered out of state with impenetrable corporate shielding. We named the entity Apex Capital Holdings. Once the corporate shell was legally established and heavily fortified, I authorized a direct wire transfer of $3 million from my newly accessible $25 million cash trust into the Apex accounts. Silas had left me that fortune to protect myself, and I was loading it directly into the chamber. Working through my highly compensated corporate brokers, Apex Capital Holdings contacted the Miami syndicate directly. Shadow lenders operating in the gray areas of private equity are aggressively pragmatic. They held a high-risk defaulting debt from a fake tech entrepreneur who was actively dodging their calls and missing compounding interest payments. When my proxy offered to purchase Connor's entire debt portfolio for an immediate liquid cash buyout, the syndicate did not hesitate for a single second. They wanted the liability off their books. They sold the $2 million debt along with every single lien contract and collateral promissory note attached to it without a second thought. The entire acquisition took exactly 4 hours to finalize. I sat at my desk and watched the confirmation emails roll into my secure server. I opened the attached digital files and reviewed the heavily notarized contracts. I ran my fingers over my keyboard, a cold satisfaction washing over me. I now legally owned every single cent of Connor's massive debt. I held the exclusive legal right to call in the loan, demand immediate payment in full, and seize whatever pathetic fabricated assets he actually possessed. Connor thought he owed his life to dangerous criminals in Florida. He thought he could stall them just long enough to steal my inheritance and pay them off. He had absolutely no idea that his entire financial existence was now resting entirely in the palm of my hand. I was his judge, his jury, and his absolute executioner. He was planning to host a glamorous party to celebrate his fake wealth, but he was essentially a puppet dancing on strings that I now controlled. Jamal knocked briefly before entering my office, his silver tablet in hand. He placed it on my desk, bringing up a complex web of red and green data nodes. The tracing algorithms had worked flawlessly. Jamal's team had successfully mapped the entire network of shell companies Desmond and Vivian had used. The data proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that they had funneled illegal commercial loans through my identity to fund Kendra's lavish lifestyle and bail out Connor's failing tech startup. We had the IP addresses, the signature verifications, and the exact timestamps. The digital proof was absolutely ironclad. I pulled up the group text message Vivian had sent earlier to the church congregation and the country club elite, inviting them to her lavish weekend gala. I read the glowing words about celebrating Silas' true legacy and smiled. I had the legal documents. I had the digital proof. I owned the debt. I looked out the window at the Atlanta skyline, watching the sun begin to set over the city. Let them throw their perfect party. Let them invite every single person they know. I was entirely ready for Saturday. The coffee shop was the same place where we used to study together before the wedge between us became a canyon. Kendra sat across from me in a booth that felt suffocatingly small. She looked impeccably polished, her silk blouse a stark contrast to the casual sweater I wore, but her eyes lacked the usual vapid sparkle. She was desperate. She slid a check for $5,000 across the marble tabletop like a piece of refuse. "Drop your claims to the estate," Aaliyah, Kendra whispered, leaning in so the other patrons wouldn't hear. "Just walk away from the gala this Saturday and keep your mouth shut. Take the money. It's more than you'd earn in a month at that cybersecurity firm." I didn't reach for the check. I didn't even acknowledge it. I just looked at her, watching the nervous tick in her jaw. "Connor parents are flying in from New York tomorrow," she continued, her voice rising with a frantic, forced snobbery. "They are high society, Aaliyah. They expect prestige. They expect perfection. We can't have your natural hair and that miserable, bitter attitude of yours ruining the aesthetic of our event. You're a liability. This money is charity. It's the only way you'll ever be part of this family's legacy, by disappearing before the doors open." The audacity of her suggestion, the way she weaponized my own appearance and heritage to justify her greed, finally silenced the last shred of sibling affection I held for her. I didn't feel anger anymore. I felt a strange, chilling clarity. I picked up the check with 2 fingers. Kendra's smirk widened clearly, thinking I was calculating how much more I could squeeze out of her. Instead, I tore the check slowly down the middle, the sound of the paper ripping loud in the quiet shop. I dropped the 2 pieces into her overpriced iced latte, watching as the ink began to bleed into the melting coffee-colored liquid. I stood up my chair, scraping harshly against the floor. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. The look of utter shock and growing horror on her face was worth more than the $5,000 she had just thrown away. I walked out into the humid Atlanta afternoon, leaving her staring at her ruined drink as if it were a harbinger of the disaster waiting for her this Saturday. My phone buzzed the moment I hit the sidewalk. It was a push notification from the local property record database, an automated update alert. Someone had just attempted to file an emergency lien on the Vance estate. The metadata on the filing was linked to an IP address associated with a private law firm I knew Desmond used for his shadiest business dealings. They weren't just planning a party, They were frantically trying to create a paper trail of ownership while I was busy securing the debt. They were digging their own graves, and I was going to make sure the shovel was heavy. I drove back to my office, my mind racing through the logistics of the gala. I had confirmed with Arthur that the federal agents were ready. The FBI had already processed the ledger and the wire fraud documentation regarding my stolen Social Security number. They were simply waiting for the cue. The gala was the perfect trap. It was the moment the public facade of the Vance family would be most fragile and the moment their private crimes would become public record. Back in my office, I called Jamal to check on the progress of the Apex Capital Holdings proxy acquisition. Did the syndicate transfer the debt documentation? I asked, not waiting for him to finish his greeting. It's all here, Jamal confirmed, his voice excited. I've reviewed the promissory notes. Connor signed them personally, using the estate as collateral even though he doesn't own it. That's a direct confession of intent to defraud creditors. We have enough to initiate a foreclosure process the second you give the word. I looked at the clock. It was Wednesday. The gala was 2 days away. My parents were likely in the midst of final preparations, spending money they didn't have, sending invitations they had no right to issue, and living in a fantasy world of generational wealth that was about to vanish. I started crafting the final part of my plan. I didn't just want the FBI to arrest them. I wanted the entire city of Atlanta to understand exactly what they had been celebrating. I drafted a press release not under my own name, but through an anonymous investigative journalism platform that specialized in exposing corporate and white-collar fraud. I attached the scanned copies of the ledger pages that detailed how my parents had used my identity to fund Kendra's lifestyle. I included the details of Connor's $2 million debt to the Miami syndicate. The story was explosive. It would hit the major news desks on Saturday morning, just hours before the gala began. As I worked, a new notification pinged on my screen. It was an email from the head of the church committee where my parents were members. Aaliyah, we've been hearing rumors regarding the upcoming Silas Vance Legacy Foundation Gala. Some of our donors are expressing concern over the conflicting reports about the ownership of the estate and the legal status of the foundation. We would appreciate a private meeting to clarify your position before you potentially attend the event. I smiled. The cracks were showing. My parents' desperation was becoming visible even to the people they were trying to fool. I didn't reply to the committee head. Instead, I sent a brief, polite email to the pastor of the church, thanking him for his concern and promising that all truths would be revealed on Saturday evening. I invited him to attend the gala personally, ensuring he would have a front-row seat to the unfolding catastrophe. I spent the next 48 hours in a state of high-alert preparation. I worked with the security team at the estate to ensure that when we arrived on Saturday, we wouldn't just be guests. We would be the owners returning to our home. We reviewed the blueprints, the access points, and the guest list. By Friday night, I felt the familiar weight of the legacy Silas had left me. It wasn't just the millions of dollars or the prime real estate. It was the responsibility to clean out the rot. My parents had spent 2 decades poisoning the soil of our family, and they had groomed Kendra to continue the harvest of deceit. It was time for a scorched earth policy. Saturday morning began with a sense of quiet intensity. I woke up early, dressed in a sharp, tailored black suit that signaled business rather than celebration. I visited my grandfather's grave before the sun was high. I stood there for a long time, the air cool and still. "I'm doing this for you, Silas," I whispered, feeling the weight of the ledger in my bag. "I'm doing this for the name you built, and for the life they tried to take from me." When I returned home, my phone started chiming with news alerts. The anonymous press release had hit the wire. Vance Estate Scandal, Embezzlement, Identity Fraud, and Mob Debt, Cloud Legacy Gala. The headlines were brutal. By noon, the local Atlanta stations were leading their broadcasts with the story. The details were all there, spelled out in the cold, hard prose of the ledger. I checked my social media. The public response was a tidal wave of outrage. The comment section of the church's group page was locked after members began demanding answers about the gala. My parents were silent. They had to be. They were likely currently at the estate frantically trying to stop the fallout, convinced they could talk their way out of a $2 million mob debt and a federal investigation. At 6 o'clock, I met Arthur Holloway at the estate entrance. He was waiting in a black sedan, looking more energized than I had seen him in weeks. We watched as service trucks, florists, and catering crews moved with frantic energy to prepare for the gala. They had no idea they were setting up for a funeral of a different kind. "Are you ready?" Arthur asked, checking his watch. "The federal agents are positioned at the perimeter. They are waiting for our signal." I looked up at the house. The windows were ablaze with light. Music was already playing, a soft jazz ensemble practicing in the foyer. It was the home where I had spent my childhood, the home they had tried to steal, and the home that had witnessed every one of their lies. "I'm ready," I said. "Let's go reclaim what is ours." We stepped out of the car. My heels clicked against the stone driveway, a sharp, rhythmic sound that cut through the music. The estate's security staff stepped forward to block our path, but stopped when they saw Arthur, who was well known to everyone connected to the Vance empire. "We are here for the gala," Arthur said, his voice dripping with authority, "and we are here to see the hosts. Here too." The security guards glanced at each other, clearly caught in the middle of a shifting hierarchy. Before they could protest, the front door swung open. Desmond stood there, his face glowing with a mix of wine-induced confidence and sheer, unadulterated arrogance. He didn't see me at first, his eyes fixed on Arthur. "Arthur, what are you doing here? You know you aren't invited to private functions." He then looked down, his eyes locking with mine. His smile didn't just fade, it disintegrated. "You!" He hissed the word, his face turning an alarming shade of plum. "What are you doing here? This is a private foundation gala. You have no business here." I stepped into the light of the entryway, the massive crystal chandelier reflecting in my eyes. "I have quite a lot of business here, Desmond," I said, my voice cutting through the laughter from the ballroom. "In fact, I'm the primary reason everyone is here tonight." The wind whipped across the concrete plaza, but I didn't feel the chill. I stood near the imposing stone steps of the federal building, my coat buttoned against the gust, holding the heavy manila envelope that contained everything. Malik, an investigator I had worked with on 3 separate corporate espionage cases, stood before me. He didn't look like a typical suit. He had the tired, sharp eyes of a man who spent his life chasing down ghosts in digital ledgers. He took the envelope, sliding the documents out just enough to catch a glimpse of the meticulously recorded wire transfers and forged identity filings. The weight of his silence told me everything I needed to know. "We have enough here to pull the thread on the entire web," Malik said, his voice barely audible over the hum of city traffic. "These aren't just minor accounting errors, Aaliyah. This is a decade of systematic federal wire fraud and identity theft. The arrest warrants will be signed by a federal judge by Saturday night." I felt a profound grounding release as he spoke. This was the end of the line for the Vance family's illusion of perfection. Malik looked at me, his gaze searching. "You understand that once I hand this over, the federal machine doesn't stop. They will raid the estate and they won't care if there's a black tie gala in progress." I gave him a sharp, confident nod. "That is exactly what I need, Malik. I want them to realize their power is gone while they are standing in front of the people they spent their entire lives trying to impress." I left Malik and walked back to my car, the tension of the last few days finally beginning to dissipate. My phone pulsed in my bag. I didn't need to look at the screen to know who it was. The buzzing was persistent, aggressive, and entirely predictable. I finally pulled the device out and hit play on the newest voicemail from Desmond. His voice was a jagged mess of rage and panic, stripped of his usual practiced composure. "Aaliyah, you arrogant little bitch!" Desmond roared, the audio distorting with the intensity of his shouting. "I know you think you have some leverage because you're hiding behind that old man's lawyers, but you have no idea who you are dealing with. If you even think about setting foot on the Vance estate this Saturday, I have already spoken to the chief of police. You will be arrested for trespassing and harassment before you can even get out of your car. Stay away from the gala, stay away from our family, or I will make sure you are taken out in handcuffs in front of everyone. Do not test me." I listened to the recording twice, then calmly deleted it. He was trying to use the local precinct as his own private security detail, completely unaware that he was about to be the primary target of a federal task force. He didn't realize that the local cops he bragged about couldn't touch me, not when I was under the protective umbrella of a federal investigation. The drive back to my office felt different. The city lights of Atlanta looked like a game board where I had already moved every piece into place. I called Arthur Holloway, who answered before the first ring finished. "The evidence is in Malik's hands," I said, pulling into the parking structure of my firm. "The judge will have the warrants by Saturday night. Desmond just left a voicemail threatening me with arrest by the local police if I attend the gala." Arthur chuckled, a low, dry sound. "He's digging his own grave deeper. If he tries to use local officers to interfere with a federal investigation, he'll be adding obstruction of justice to his laundry list of crimes." I walked into my office and pulled up the security feeds for the Vance estate. The grounds were already being transformed. A massive white marquee was being erected on the main lawn, and high-end catering crews were setting up an elaborate outdoor stage. It was a production designed to show the world that the Vances had arrived, that they had successfully inherited the Silas legacy. They were going to serve champagne and caviar on a foundation of stolen identity and mob-funded debt. My lead analyst, Jamal, walked in, looking exhausted but triumphant. "We just traced another 3 shell companies, Aaliyah. They were funneling the last of the liquid capital from your parents' primary accounts into a Swiss holding firm. It looks like they're trying to liquidate everything to pay off Connor's creditors on Monday morning. They're planning to ditch the country the second the gala is over." I looked at the screen, watching the digital movement of money. They weren't just hosting a party, they were planning an escape. "Let them try," I said. "Jamal, I want you to set up a real-time monitor on all their accounts. I want an alert triggered the moment they attempt to move even a single dollar after the gala starts. If they try to hit send on that final wire transfer, I want the system to flag it as an immediate suspicious activity report. We are going to lock their liquidity at the exact moment they need it most." I had 48 hours left. I spent the remainder of the evening reviewing the final layout of the gala. I knew exactly where Desmond, Vivian, Kendra, and Connor would be positioned. I knew which church elders they were trying to butter up, and which society influencers were on the guest list. I had already sent a private message to the lead investigative reporter at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. I didn't give them the ledger that was for the feds, but I gave them a list of questions to ask my parents when they walked into that gala. Questions about the mysterious source of Connor's startup capital and the sudden legal trouble facing the estate. By Friday afternoon, the tension was so thick I could almost taste it. I received a delivery at my office, a large, opulent gift basket filled with expensive fruit and high-end spirits. A card was tucked inside, signed by Kendra. "Thinking of you, Aaliyah. I know things are hard, but we can all be better than this. Join us tomorrow." It was a pathetic, transparent attempt to lure me to the estate so they could have me arrested before I had a chance to present my case to the feds. I looked at the basket, then pushed it off my desk into the trash can. I didn't need their fruit, and I certainly didn't need their empty gestures. I spent the final evening before the gala in total silence. I stood on my balcony overlooking the city, breathing in the cool night air. I felt the weight of my grandfather's ledger in my bag, a physical reminder of the life I had been forced to protect. I wasn't just fighting for an estate anymore, I was fighting for the truth. On Saturday morning, I woke up with the kind of clarity that only comes from knowing exactly how the day will end. I called Arthur and Jamal to confirm the final status of our operations. The federal judge had indeed signed the warrants late the previous evening. The FBI was staged. The debt documentation was ready to be presented. I took one last look at my reflection in the mirror. I didn't look like the woman they had tried to break. I looked like the person I had been forced to become, sharp, unyielding, and ready to reclaim my name. I grabbed my bag and headed for the car. The estate was only 30 minutes away, but the drive felt like a slow-motion march toward a reckoning. As I turned onto the long gravel road leading up to the house, I could see the floodlights illuminating the massive tents. Valet cars were already lining the entrance. Security was tight with uniformed guards checking invitations at the main gate. I didn't slow down. I reached the gate, rolled down my window, and watched the guard's face shift from confusion to alarm as he recognized me. "Wait here," he said, his hand hovering over his radio. "I have orders to call Mr. Vance the moment you arrive." I didn't answer. I just kept my eyes fixed on the house, the home where they had hidden their sins for 15 years. I was not there to be stopped. I was there to preside over the collapse. Desmond appeared on the porch moments later, flanked by two of his private security team. He looked smug, certain that he had won. He didn't see the black sedans parked out of view on the main road. He didn't see the plainclothes officers who had already infiltrated the service entrance. He walked down the steps toward my car, his face twisted into a cruel grin. "I told you, Aaliyah," he shouted over the sound of the outdoor jazz band. "I told you if you stepped on this property, you'd leave in cuffs." "Guards, remove her from the premises." I turned off the ignition, stepped out of the car and looked at him, then at the camera crews he had hired to document the gala. I didn't look at the guards. I looked directly at the crowd of guests spilling out onto the lawn. "I'm not here to be removed, Desmond," I said, my voice projecting across the silent garden. "I'm here because it's time to announce the true legacy of this estate." Desmond lunged for me, his composure finally shattering, but a voice from the shadows stopped him dead in his tracks. "Mr. Vance, stay exactly where you are," a man said, walking from behind the line of trees. It was Malik. He wasn't alone. 6 federal agents moved out from the darkness, their badges shining in the floodlights. The music cut out. The guests went silent. The party was over, and the consequences had arrived. Desmond's face turned an unnatural shade of mottled gray. He clutched the microphone so tightly, his knuckles bled white, his gaze darting frantically from me to the stunned faces of the church elders. The jazz ensemble had stopped playing mid-note, leaving a vacuum of silence that felt heavier than the grand chandeliers hanging above us. Vivienne, who had been laughing a moment before, stood frozen near the punch bowl, her hand trembling so violently that the champagne in her glass sloshed onto her silk dress. Kendra stood beside Connor, her mouth agape, looking like she had just seen a ghost walk through the solid oak doors. I didn't wait for them to recover. I walked toward the front of the ballroom, the click of my heels echoing like gavel strikes on the polished marble. Every pair of eyes in the room followed me. They saw the Aaliyah they had tried to erase, the one they had belittled as the black sheep, the failure, the unwanted burden. But tonight, I was the architect of their downfall. I reached the center of the room, turning to face the crowd, and I could feel the power radiating from my stance. I didn't just look like I belonged here. I looked like I owned the very air they were breathing. Vivienne found her voice first, a piercing, hysterical shriek that cut through the silence. "Security! I told you to remove her. She's a trespasser. Get her out of this house right now before I have you all fired." The head of security, a man named Miller, whom I had personally vetted when I bought the firm, stepped into the light. He was a mountain of a man who had worked the Vance estate gates for years, but he didn't look at Vivienne. He looked at me, gave a respectful nod, and then turned back to the crowd. "Sorry, ma'am," Miller announced, his voice booming and devoid of his usual subservience. "There has been a change in management. Miss Aaliyah is the primary stakeholder of the security firm you are currently subcontracting for. She is not a trespasser here. In fact, she holds the deed to this entire estate." A collective gasp swept through the ballroom like a physical wind. I watched as the color left Desmond's face, leaving him looking older, smaller, and utterly defeated. He looked at the crowd, desperate for an ally, but he only saw confusion and growing suspicion. The church elders were whispering, their expressions shifting from polite celebration to open distress. "Desmond," I said, my voice smooth and dangerously calm, "I think you should put the microphone down. You've had your moment of performance, but it's time to deal with reality." He didn't move. He stood there, the microphone held out like a dead weight. "You think a piece of paper gives you the right to walk in here?" He snarled, his voice low and vibrating with contained fury. "You were a mistake, Aaliyah. You were never meant to be anything more than a footnote in this family's history. I've spent 20 years building this legacy, and I won't let some bitter, resentful girl tear it down for a petty grudge." I reached into my bag and pulled out the leather ledger. I didn't open it. The sight of it alone was enough to make Connor take a step back, his eyes fixed on the cover as if it were a bomb. "This isn't a grudge, Desmond. It's an audit," I said, walking closer until I was standing right at the edge of the stage. "You've been living in a house of cards built on stolen identities and illegal loans. You've been masquerading as a titan of industry while you were secretly leveraging my future to pay for Kendra's lifestyle and Connor's debt." Connor, who had been trying to shrink into the background, suddenly bristled. "Who the hell do you think you are?" he shouted, stepping forward with his chest puffed out, trying to reclaim his alpha status. "You're just a bitter, failed cybersecurity techie. I'm a venture capitalist. I have $2 million in backing for my firm. I'm a billionaire in the making." I looked at him and I couldn't help but laugh. It was a cold, sharp sound. "Billionaire Connor, you're not a venture capitalist. You're a debtor, and as of 4 hours ago, you aren't backed by a syndicate in Miami anymore. I bought your debt. I own your loans, your liens, and every single promissory note you've signed in the last 3 years. You don't work for your backers. You work for me." The air left the room. Connor looked like he had been struck. His face turned pale, and for a second he looked like he might collapse. What he whispered, his bravado vanishing instantly. "That's impossible. They wouldn't sell." "They were very eager to get rid of you," I said, stepping right into his personal space. "They didn't think you were worth the risk. And frankly, neither do I." Vivienne was moving now, pushing her way through the crowd, her diamonds flashing. She had reached a state of pure, unadulterated panic. "Aaliyah, baby, please." She grabbed at my arm, her touch frantic. "We can discuss this. We are a family. We can work this out behind closed doors. Don't do this to us. Don't do this to your sister. Think about the church. Think about your reputation." I pulled my arm away as if her skin were burning. "Don't talk to me about reputation, Vivienne. You were the one who taught me that appearances were everything. You were the one who taught me to hide the truth to keep the image perfect." Well, look around. The image is shattered. The church elders are watching. The investigative reporters are likely already receiving the emails about your wire fraud. The reputation you care about so much is currently being shredded in the public eye. Desmond finally regained his voice, but it was hollow. He looked around the ballroom, seeing the faces of the donors he had spent months courting. They were retreating. The society influencers were looking at their phones, clearly seeing the news alerts that had just hit the wire. "Get out," he whispered. "Get out of my house." "It isn't your house," I corrected him. "It's Silas's house." And Silas left it to me. At that exact moment, the heavy double doors of the ballroom swung open again. This time it wasn't me walking in. It was the lead federal agent flanked by 2 officers. They didn't look like guests. They looked like the end of the world. Desmond Vance. The agent said, his voice ringing out across the ballroom. "You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes." The guests scattered. It was a chaotic scramble for the exits, people tripping over their own feet in their rush to get away from the falling empire. Vivienne let out a long, shuddering wail and collapsed onto the stage, her diamonds catching the light one last time. Kendra stood in the corner staring at Connor with a look of pure, toxic betrayal. She wasn't looking at him with love anymore. She was looking at him like a drowning woman looking at a boat anchor. Connor didn't try to defend her. He just turned and bolted for the service entrance, his expensive shoes sliding on the polished floor. I watched as the agents approached Desmond, their handcuffs glinting in the chandelier light. He didn't fight. He just went limp, the arrogance draining out of him, replaced by the crushing reality of his choices. I looked at Arthur, who was standing by the door, watching the entire scene with a look of quiet satisfaction. We had done it. We had stripped away the lies, destroyed the fraud, and reclaimed the legacy. As they led Desmond out, the agent stopped by me. "Miss Vance," he said, nodding toward the ledger. "Thank you. You made our job very easy." I turned back to the room. It was empty now, save for the agents, my staff, and the wreckage of my parents' ruined lives. I walked over to the spot where Vivienne was still sitting on the stage. I didn't feel triumph. I felt an immense, overwhelming sense of peace. The rot had been removed. I walked out of the ballroom through the front doors and into the cool night air. The gala was over. The legacy was mine. And for the first time, I could finally breathe. The ballroom plunged into a chaos so absolute, it felt like the very foundation of the Vance estate had been ripped away. I didn't stumble. I didn't hesitate. I glided past my father, whose jaw was slack, his face a mask of primal fear. He tried to grab my arm, but I spun away with a grace that felt like a slap in the face. I reached the podium, my fingertips brushing the cool metal of the microphone. With a few precise taps on my phone, I bypassed the audio-visual controls that had been looping pretentious congratulatory videos about the Vance legacy. The giant LED screen behind the stage flickered the images of my parents' curated success vanishing. In their place, a document appeared in high definition. It was the court-certified original last will and testament of Silas Vance, dated 3 days before his passing. It was signed, sealed, and indisputable. The room gasped as the text scrolled down, highlighting the specific clause that bequeathed the entire estate, the operating funds, and the $25 million cash trust solely to me. That's a forgery. Kendra shrieked, her voice cracking as she shoved her way to the front of the stage. Her face was contorted, the refined mask of the socialite crumbling into something ugly and frantic. You hacked the archives, you stole that document and doctored it. Nobody. Look at that screen. It's all a lie. A pathetic, desperate lie from a girl who was never loved. I didn't blink. I simply swiped to the next slide. It wasn't a will. It was the comprehensive forensic audit Jamal had prepared. The screen was now filled with a cascading list of bank routing numbers, offshore entity names, and the damning timestamps of unauthorized wire transfers. Is it a lie, Kendra? I asked. My voice amplified throughout the hall, cool and lethal. Is it a lie like the illegal commercial loans you and Mom took out using my social security number? Is it a lie like the money you funneled into your little lifestyle while I was struggling to keep my firm afloat? I turned my gaze to Connor, who was backed against a decorative pillar looking for an exit that didn't exist. He looked like a man who had just realized he was standing on a trap door. And Connor, I added, raising my voice so the entire room could hear, I think his parents would find this slide particularly interesting. The screen shifted to a detailed breakdown of Connor's $2 million debt to the Miami syndicate. It listed the interest rates, the missed payment notifications, and the brutal warnings of physical retaliation. Then I displayed the legal documentation I had acquired earlier that week, the contracts showing that Apex Capital Holdings, my proxy, was now the sole creditor. I haven't just purchased your debt, Connor, I said, my tone conversational. I've become your primary liability. And as of 10 minutes ago, I have formally reported your default to every major financial regulatory body in this country. You aren't just broke. You're a professional fraud, and now you're a bankrupt one. Connor's parents, who had been standing near the buffet table, suddenly pushed forward, their faces burning with a mixture of shame and fury. They were titans of the New York social scene, people who lived for prestige. Seeing their son's name linked to mob debt and blatant identity theft was a stain they couldn't endure. Connor, is this true? His mother asked, her voice shaking with rage. The debt, the embezzlement, the fake tech startup, is every cent of your life a sham? Connor couldn't speak. He just stared at the screen, his mouth working silently. His father, a man who had built his own fortune on ironclad contracts, looked at his son with utter disgust. We came here to support a legacy, he spat, turning on his heel. Instead, we're witnessing the pathetic end of a common criminal. Don't call us. Don't come home. You're no longer our son. They marched out of the ballroom, their departure as swift and cold as the truth I had just laid bare. The room was in a frenzy. Society influencers were live streaming the entire meltdown, their cameras capturing every second of my parents' humiliation. The church elders looked physically ill, huddled in a corner, their prestige tied to a family that was currently being exposed as nothing more than a ring of petty thieves. Vivienne scrambled toward the stage, her hands clutching at the air. Aaliyah, listen to me, we did this for you, she cried, her voice hitting a register of sheer pathetic terror. We were trying to preserve the estate for you. We were only managing it into the ground. I countered, turning the screen to the final slide, the federal warrant application. Desmond, I'm sure the local police you threatened to call are already outside, but they aren't here to arrest me. They're here to provide perimeter support for the FBI task force that just entered the building. At that moment, the heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom swung open. A dozen federal agents in tactical windbreakers moved in with terrifying efficiency, their presence commanding an immediate shocked silence. The air in the room was electric with the weight of justice. Desmond stood frozen, his eyes wide as the lead agent approached him. He looked from me to the agents, his arrogance finally and completely evaporated. Desmond Vance, you are under arrest. The agent stated, his voice flat and detached. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. Vivian let out a strangled sob and slumped against the podium, the diamonds that had been bought on my credit shivering as she shook. Kendra simply stood there paralyzed, watching her entire world dissolve into handcuffs and legal records. I didn't feel a flicker of joy, just a profound, grounding sense of release. I walked past my father as the agents clicked the metal cuffs around his wrists. He looked at me, a glimmer of desperate recognition in his eyes, but I didn't stop. I kept walking. I reached the doorway, stopping briefly to look back at the wreckage. I had come here to reclaim what was mine, to stop the rot, and to rewrite the legacy that had tried to consume me. The gala was in total shambles. The music had stopped, the guests were fleeing, and my parents were facing the reality of the crimes they had committed. I stepped out onto the estate grounds. The night air was crisp and clean. Behind me, the lights of the Vance estate glowed, but the darkness was finally being pushed back. I reached into my bag, pulled out the deed to the estate, and touched the embossed seal. It was mine. The debt was settled. The predators were being removed. I didn't look back at the house, at the flashing blue lights of the police cars, now streaming down the long driveway, or at the frantic whispers of the socialites who had come to celebrate a lie. I turned toward the gate, toward the road, and toward a future that I would build on my own terms. The Vance name in all its broken, deceitful glory would end with me. And tomorrow, I would begin to build a new name, one that stood for truth, for integrity, and for a legacy that couldn't be forged. I had entered the lion's den, and I was the one walking out with the crown. The ballroom descended into absolute deafening chaos. The blue and red lights from the patrol cars outside bled through the floor-to-ceiling windows, bathing the elegant evening wear of the guests in the harsh, strobe-like glare of justice. Before the jazz band could even finish the discordant trail of their final note, Malik led the federal team through the double doors. The congregation of elite socialites and church elders recoiled, creating a wide, hollow circle around the Vance family. Desmond stood paralyzed as Malik approached, his handcuffs already pulled from his belt. When the steel clicked around Desmond's wrists, the sound was louder than any gavel. Vivian tried to lunge forward, her face twisted in a mask of hysterical denial, but an agent gently but firmly restrained her, forcing her hands behind her back. Connor was the last to go, his face pale and sweating, his designer suit looking like a costume from a play he had already lost. Kendra had stopped screaming. She was now huddled on the cold marble floor, her manicured fingers clawing at the expensive fabric of her dress, her golden child facade completely pulverized. The silence in the room was heavier than the crystal chandeliers overhead. As the agents prepared to escort them toward the exit, Vivian caught my gaze. Her eyes were wide, desperate, and filled with a sudden clawing need for the daughter she had spent years trying to dismantle. "Aaliyah," she shrieked, her voice cracking. "Aaliyah, please, tell them there's been a mistake. Tell them you're our family and you can handle this. You're a Vance. Do something. Help us." I walked toward her, my footsteps steady and deliberate, until I was standing over her. I looked down, not with anger, but with a chilling, detached clarity. I remembered the night 15 years ago when she had looked at me after I'd failed a minor test and told me with cold, clinical precision that failures didn't belong in this family. "You told me failures didn't belong in this family, Vivian," I said, my voice cutting through the hushed room like a razor. "You spent years drilling that into my head, making sure I knew I was an unwanted burden. You were right. Failures like you, Desmond and Connor, don't belong here. This isn't your family anymore, and it certainly isn't your home. Get off my property." I didn't wait for her response. I turned my back on them as they were marched out into the night, their expensive lives dissolving into the back of government-issued sedans. The gala was effectively over. The guests were fleeing in a panicked rush, leaving behind forgotten champagne glasses and the discarded remnants of a shattered reputation. 6 months later, the air at the Vance estate felt different. The tension that had once permeated the very walls, the constant low-level hum of anxiety and deceit was gone, replaced by a profound, quiet stability. The estate, now officially renamed the Silas Vance Heritage Site, was no longer a stage for performance, but a place of genuine transition. Desmond, Vivian, and Connor were deep into their federal sentences, tucked away in facilities where their money and social connections couldn't reach. The federal prosecutors had been relentless, turning the documents I provided into a comprehensive case that left no room for legal maneuvering. The identity theft and the decades of systematic wire fraud had been documented with surgical precision. Kendra, having been stripped of the funds she used to maintain her lifestyle, had been evicted from her luxury condo within weeks of the arrests. She was now living in a studio apartment in the outskirts of the city, working as a cashier at a high-end retail shop where she was forced to serve the very people she once looked down upon. She had tried to reach out to me via letters pleading, threatening, then pleading again, but I had redirected them all to my legal team, who kept them filed away as evidence of her continued obsession. I stood on the wide wraparound porch of the estate, breathing in the scent of pine and damp earth. The $25 million trust, once the source of so much contention and cruelty, had been transformed. I had redirected a significant portion of those funds into the Silas Vance Scholarship Fund. It wasn't just money. It was a pipeline for minority women entering fields like STEM and cybersecurity industries, where I had been told over and over that I didn't belong. I saw the faces of the first cohort of students every time I logged into the fund's portal. They were brilliant, ambitious, and unburdened by the legacy of debt and deception that had almost defined me. Arthur Holloway had become a trusted advisor, helping me navigate the legal restructuring of the estate and ensuring that the properties were being managed with transparency. We had turned the primary ballroom into a community education center. No longer was the estate a closed fortress of greed. It was a hub for local development and growth. I looked out over the rolling grounds, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The fire that had once threatened to consume me, the gaslighting, the betrayal, the isolation hadn't destroyed me. I had taken the heat, processed it, and turned it into fuel. I realized then that they had never really wanted to burn me. They had wanted to shape me into a version of themselves. But I hadn't let them. I hadn't just survived their fire, I owned the flames. I was the one who had cleared the brush, who had burned away the dead wood, and who was now standing on the clean, fertile ground I had reclaimed for myself. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a notification from my lead analyst, Jamal, about the progress of the Community Education Center's renovation. I smiled, tucked the phone away, and turned back to the quiet house. For the first time, this place truly felt like home. The legacy of the Vance family had been a curse of secrets and shadows, but the legacy I was building now was one of light, integrity, and absolute unwavering truth. I walked inside the door, closing softly behind me, leaving the past firmly where it belonged in the rearview mirror. This story serves as a powerful reminder that your worth is never defined by those who refuse to see it. While betrayal from family can leave deep scars, it also provides the clarity needed to reclaim your independence and build a life on your own terms. True strength lies in setting boundaries, trusting your own vision, and understanding that you are never obligated to accept mistreatment for the sake of an empty title. Have you ever had to choose yourself when your family wouldn't share your story? In the comments below.